Hi everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. John is a gardening, hiking, home chefing, chopped liver hating published author. Described by others as creative, colourful and curious, John, who is a therapist / coach / counsellor, is also an adventurer, always looking to learn something new. Welcome, John.
Thank you. It's delightful to chat with you today.
I'm really looking forward to our chat because anyone that is curious and colourful is my kind of person.
Well, it's really fascinating. One of the things for me that's so important, like to maintain my interest in the world, my interest in my work, but also like my vibrancy, is to be like adventurously curious. I think so many of us, like we go along in life and we just kind of like, this is the way I do things, the way I've always done things. And to me, it's like, I'm just so curious about the world we live in, both for learning, for experiencing, even the concept that like I park away from stuff and then walk to work so I can see like new things that are happening in my neighborhood every morning.
I love that. It actually makes me think of a tattoo that I had on my foot. So I've got several tattoos, but there are 4 that are phrases to remind myself that there are some things that are inherent to me and some things I need to keep reminding myself to do. And the one on my foot is on my right foot and it says, walk to the edge. And I kind of,
Mm.
that to me is that adventurous, like push yourself, learn, go beyond, but just to the edge, like just don't go too far.
And it's interesting because I would philosophically say that I actually like to take that step off the cliff. I
Okay.
like to trust that I'm going to fly. I like to trust
Mm.
that in that unknown space, I'm going to be challenged, but I'm also going
Mhm.
to learn a lot about myself and the world around me. So I actually take that next step. So come join me sometime.
Well, if I add my other 3 in, I think they're all balancing. So one of them is play with abandon. So
Mhm.
that one there is obviously for the lightness, and then it's for the practice wellness, to make sure I look after my health because I have notorious ability to work nonstop. And then live with intention. So make
Mhm.
sure that we make choices based on our own needs rather than someone else's.
Mhm.
So anyway, off topic on me and back onto you. I want to know. So you're a published author. What's your book about? What's it called?
So the book is called Out, A Parent's Guide to Supporting Your LGBTQIA plus kid through coming out and beyond. And this is work that I specialize in as a therapist, is helping kids come out and help families during the coming out process. And over the years of experience that I've had and the education I've had in this process, it just suddenly became really important to put this book together. And just as I was reaching that pinnacle point of getting ready to do it, a publisher reached out to me looking for someone to write on this topic. And it was like kismet, and
Yes.
everything came together. And it was an amazing process.
So serendipitous. Means that the universe needed it and it was meant to happen, of course. I'm sure that you believe that. I it's interesting. I just only recorded a session um before yours with someone that didn't come out until their 30s. And that was after several years in a straight marriage and 3 children. And we talked through all of that. Um, so if anyone else is looking back through the podcasts of season 2, you're looking for Tony's episode on that one. But, it brings to mind that hopefully one day, and not, I mean, I want you to have obviously a career, but hopefully one day no one has to come out.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because there's a conversation in the LGBTQ community that pushes against having to come out and invite people in.
Mm.
So we're sometimes looking at it as what we call a coming in process. But the thing that's really cool about going through this is, as a queer man walking through the world and growing up, I did have to like examine the world that I was living in. I did have to do a process of finding my way through, of finding my identity, of expressing that into the world. And it's actually a pretty amazing process that is something that a lot of cisgender and heterosexual people don't go through.
Hmm.
So years later, I can look back at with a little retrospect, looking back at all that fear and anxiety that played out then, but also understand that it turned me into someone who really had to examine my life and make statements about who I was going into the world. So I think there's an interesting balance about this idea of a coming out or coming in process.
Mm. I've never heard the coming in process, and I actually think that's brilliant. Um, Before we get too deep into things, because I feel like we could go straight there, but make sure that we keep to the structure of every episode. You completed a questionnaire, and from 50 something identities, you selected three. What were they for you?
So I selected male, I selected LGBTQIA plus, and I selected aging.
Okay.
And it's interesting because all three of those words have, I think, really interesting definitions in the way I move through my world.
So, what do they mean to you then? What does the intersection of all those things mean for who you are today, John?
Well, at the beginning, at the most basic, the idea of the identity of male.
Mm.
We move through a world that has a very binary description of how people are. There's male and there's female. There's masculine and feminine. And because of the work that I do and the work I've done for myself, this identity of male has a whole different meaning for me. It doesn't fall into kind of a stereotypical idea of what maleness is. For me, it's a balance of all of these, like, what we might call a feminine energy, a listening, a caring, compassionate. But why does that have to be female or feminine? And then this other side, rough, tough, boys don't cry side. Well, why does that have to be male? So for me, this has been an integration of all of these qualities that make my maleness, I think, very unique to me and something that I like to celebrate into the world. Same piece of the puzzle with the LGBTQIA plus identity. And yes, I can say that quickly because I say it all the time. Most people stumble over it, but here's the piece of the puzzle. So when I was younger and came out, I identified as gay. And that felt like the really authentic definition for me.
Mhm.
But also, when you say you're gay to most people, what they say is, oh, they have sex with other males
Mhm.
or they're into guys. But that doesn't describe the whole experience of what gayness can mean in the world. And this goes back to this thing that we talked about just a few moments ago about this full identity, this exploration, this like, who am I in the world? And so I now identify quite authentically as queer. And well, for me, what that encompasses, it encompasses my journey. It encompasses the history of the LGBTQIA plus community. I'm an activist, I'm an educator, I'm an advocate out in the world. So that queer identity has much more authentic meaning to me now. Once
Mm.
again, as we go through life, we change and regrow. And that connects to the aging thing.
Yeah.
Most people like think about aging as like, oh, I'm getting decrepit and I need a cane and a walker and look at all the wrinkles on my face and all that. And to me, aging is this beautiful developmental process. If I wasn't aging, think of the alternative. I
Mhm.
wouldn't be here. But
Mhm.
aging is this privilege we get to grow, to keep learning, to develop into more of who we are. And that's why, to me, aging is not a thing to be afraid of, but a beautiful thing that we can embrace and find out what that identity becomes as we keep growing.
Oh, brilliantly said, John. One thing that I do want to go back to is ask around, the term queer. Really, I was born in the 70s. I can't assume when you were born, John, but the queer term for a very long time was an insult.
Mhm.
So and so I imagine you're aware of that. And then now there's a reclaiming to that term. How would you describe that's occurred for the LGBTQI plus community?
So I would say there's generational energy about the word queer. And you're right, queer is used as a derogatory term towards the community for a long time. But taking back the word means I take the power.
Mm.
This word that you used to, say was a bad thing, I now own and say, no, it's an authentic piece of who I am. And that transition can be incredibly powerful. It is a controversial term, even within the community itself. There are people who embrace it and think it's a wonderful way to move, and there are people who adamantly push against it.
Mm.
And so I think once again, it's about the individuality of identification and understanding what those words mean to that person and how they affect the environment they work through.
Absolutely. It really is unique, right? So it's to the individual.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
The
my husband, for him, authentic identity for him is gay.
Yeah, okay.
He understands me being queer and what that means, but for
Mhm.
him, it's not a word that's authentic to his identity. So
Okay.
he identifies as gay, and we happily move through the world together.
Perfect. The more I speak to the younger generation coming through, so teens now and people in their early 20s, and I love that the term queer is being adopted because it gives them a possible fluidity. You know, that there was only ever male, female. There's such a binary decision to make on what your gender was. And then to have lesbian and gay is just such a binary view of what their sexuality can be. And when you can claim queer, it gives you space to continue to explore yourself until you really land on who you are.
Mhm.
So I do love that there's such more fluid term that gives you a spectrum without
Well,
definitively going, I am.
yeah, and the thing that you identify too that I think so amazing. I have parents all the time. It's like, oh, there's so many words and to identify and all this, and why can't our kids just be this way? And I point out the idea that I think it's really exciting
Mm.
because you were generationally sharing. When you were born, the binary was very strong, and maybe you weren't asking questions about your sexual orientation or gender identity. But kids today are willing to ask these questions, not just accept the status quo. I
Mhm.
think that's really exciting because it opens up so much more space for us to become fully realized human beings on this planet.
Absolutely. You mentioned very quickly, but I heard it, reference to gender identity, gender expression. There's a few variances among there. And I know parents of children that maybe LGBTQI plus identifying, and then those that are exploring their trans identity. And then parents get confused because the expression becomes different to their identity. Can you help our listeners understand all those variances?
Okay, here's the quick download version of the process. This could be an entire series
Of
for a year
course.
to actually go into this, but at its most basic level, gender represents the biological expression of what our bodies move through the world. Okay, so the best way to describe it is you're born, the doctor holds you up, slaps you on the butt, and says it's a boy, it's a girl. But all of that is dependent on external genitalia, that these are the markers they're looking at. We understand now that even biological gender is a much more expansive piece of the puzzle than we were taught in school. We were taught just the center of the curve because that was an easy way, palatable way to teach gender to people. Gender identity is my internal sense of self, this feeling of maleness, femaleness, a little bit of both, maybe neither. So rather than just saying there's a binary, I think of it as a spherical experience where we're looking at it in three-dimensional quality of how we move through the world. And then gender expression is how we show that identity to the world. What we wear, our hairstyles, where we place our voice, the social activities we get involved in. So all of these pieces of the puzzle come together to create the fullness of our gender in the world.
And then how does sexuality or sexual identity interact with those gender identities and expression?
So this is a thing that commonly happens all the time in the media. It happens with parents, it happens with educators. Gender identity and sexual orientation are two separate roads.
Yeah.
Okay, my sexual orientation has to do with my attraction. And I look at it as, sexual, physical, intellectual, emotional, that it's a fully prismatic type of attraction.
Mm.
So they are separate qualities. And sometimes people want to conflate them and bring them together and say they're the same, and they're not. So it's important. I think once upon a time, someone told me this phrase, and I think it kind of helps a lot of people. Sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender identity is who you go to bed as.
Oh, you gave me goosebumps. I love that, John. That is so
Yeah.
brilliant. Um, you know, I appreciate how the T for trans is part of the LGBTQI community. But I have a hypothesis that it would perhaps be somewhat helpful to pull the T out and add that into gender as well. Right. I'm on this fence because, it's good to be part of a community as trans and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't necessarily always fit for people when they're trying to bucket people into gender versus sexual identity.
Mhm. Yeah, and there is, I am not a member of the trans community. I
Mhm.
do identify as cisgender. And respectfully, what I am hearing from my, colleagues and community members is, yeah, a lot of people in the trans and non-binary community do not feel their needs are being addressed under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella.
Mm.
That there are specific needs that they have, and so there is this movement of connection and separation that's happening at the same time. Because
Mm.
you're right, it is beautiful to have support of a community that may be open and welcome to you in ways that perhaps the straight cis community isn't, but there's still barriers within the LGBTQ community for trans and non-binary people.
Yeah.
So we're in a space where people are kind of finding their own ways and making their own paths in this discovery.
Agreed. And I think it's also important to note for potentially our listeners that aren't connected in any way with the queer community is that the lived experience, as you said, of a trans person is very different to a non binary person, as is to a gay, a lesbian, a bi. An intersex, and so on and so forth. So, while we sort of label it as an identity, really it's a community with
Mhm.
multiple identities, with very vast different lived experiences because of their identities.
And a lot of people have challenges with that because they say transgender and they make this blanket statement. But the word transgender is an umbrella over myriad identities. And that is can be very challenging for people to understand is not just this one thing. As human beings, our brains are designed to go for the simplest, most straightforward definition. We want to live in comfort. Our brains don't want to be challenged. But the expansiveness under the transgender umbrella is actually really exciting and fascinating to witness, to experience, and to learn from so that we can maybe question some of our own ideas of identity. I have lots of parents I work with, and this is really cool thing that happens when their kid is expressing sexual orientation or gender identity. I encourage the parents to also explore their own. It's like, well, what were you told growing up? How did you learn this maleness or femaleness? How did you learn that you were straight or gay? And it's a really beautiful process to witness because they open up to this idea that maybe what they were told growing up isn't all there is.
And I think that starts to lean into and circling back to what you said before around the definition of male for you, right? And how it's not just the masculine or the traditional masculine. And I'm thinking, your intersection with a queer identity gave you space to explore the more sensitive, I'll call it, or the more feminine, in what someone else might say, traits. And so then if you flip the coin, a straight male that has been conditioned by the social narrative thinks they have to be the masculine, non-sensitive, keep it to yourself, didn't have the privilege of exploring through the queer lens. I mean, if you think about it. So your mental health, well, probably wasn't necessarily supported by the institution early in your life. Um, you have that privilege of exploring who you are and being your authentic self. I wonder, you know, there is something to be said for that.
Well, and in the work that I do, I specialize in working with the LGBTQIA plus community, but I have straight cisgender people in my work too.
Yeah.
And I'm a teen specialist. Adolescents are my sweet spot. It's what I love to do. And in the conversations, I treat this with a lot of openness. So I
Mhm.
have kids who come in, and I had a client once, male identifying kind of football player type thing. And because I'm so comfortable with these conversations, we were talking about dating, and he was discussing how, oh, it's been really challenging dating and this and that. And I just say out loud, it's like, so are we only talking about girls or are we looking at other, people as well? And because there's so much comfort in the way that I bring it in, he's like, well, I've thought about guys, but it's just not my thing.
Mm.
And that addresses that place that you're talking about. If we could talk openly about it, if we could be present with it and say, yeah, I'm a guy, and I think that guy is really nice. I think that guy's interesting. I'd like to get to know him better. To
Mhm.
understand that this sensitivity is not some statement about your maleness or your masculinity, but it's actually opening up all these different facets of who you can be as a human being.
What a great tip for parents as well, that if you from the get-go in communications around relationships, when kids get into their teens and sort of say, so instead of saying, do you like any girls? Right?
Right.
Like, who's your girlfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? Um,
Right.
any love interests? you can keep it far more gender neutral, and say, so, and then I remember saying to my son something very similar. So, are you dating guys or girls? I'm not sure. And I started with the guys first because I wanted to make sure that it was okay that that one was the first one. So I think that's a really good tip for parents,
And
to
you
give
can even
space.
go more general with that. It's like, well,
Yeah,
who do you find yourself attracted to?
yeah, good one.
Because even the idea of saying you're attracted to boys or girls is
Yeah, it's
can
still a
play on that
binary.
binary narrative.
Yeah,
So we can grow as the adults in their world and ask these more expansive questions. Well, who do you find yourself being attracted to? And
yeah,
going back to something I said earlier, looking at attraction is not just being physical, but emotional, mental, intellectual. And that we've locked so deeply into this idea that attraction has to be a sexual based response.
yes.
And attraction does not need to be a sexually based response. And I think that causes a lot of confusion for a lot of people to understand. I am so, the joke I have with people that I meet for the first time that I'm really intrigued by is like, oh my God, I want to dance in your brain. And that's intellectual
Yes,
attraction.
it
That's
is.
this magnetic energy. I feel like I want to be with this person and talk about the world and learn.
Mm.
If we can look at attraction beyond just the sexual side of it, we're going to give our kids even more space to talk about how they are attracted to people. And then we can learn from that ourselves.
I, you're flooring me. I'm learning so much, and I'm totally here for that. The I love that educating people to see beyond. I guess when you're saying boy, girl, for lack of a better term, it's the physical only.
Mhm.
And instead of it's so true, the personality traits, the intellectual traits, the emotional traits. I love that. Thank you, John. Um, I think that's a learning for everybody, beyond inclusion, to reflect on themselves. Um, do you tend to have like a top three tips for parents that have kids perhaps that are going through sexual or gender identity exploration?
The very first thing that I tell any parent is it is an honor that your kid has chosen to come out to you.
Mhm.
And in that moment, when your kid comes out to you, the number one and only thing that you should do is open your arms wide, hug them close, and tell you love them.
Mm.
Okay. That moment is really fragile, even in really supportive families. Kids, your heart rate goes up, you start sweating, you're shutting down, you're afraid of rejection because that's a story that exists very strongly in society about sharing these parts of ourselves. So as a parent, your job is to grab your kid, hug them close, and say, I love you.
Mm.
If you can do that one thing in that moment and continue to do it as they're struggling on this journey, that creates a foundation of connection that will last an entire lifetime.
Mm.
The other thing that I encourage is to remove the language of acceptance. I accept you exactly as you are. The thing for me about the word acceptance is it means I'm overlooking this flaw that I see in you, and I'm going to be the bigger person and accept you.
Language matters, doesn't it, John?
Does. And for
Yeah.
me, I say, learn to affirm your kid, learn to embrace your kid, learn to love your kid exactly as they are. And that little shift can once again create a beautiful foundation where your kid will feel supported simply by knowing you see them on an equal level,
Mm.
not on some, I'm looking down and accepting you and granting you the permission to be who you are. Because that's not a safe paradigm for anybody.
Do you have a sentence someone could replace it with? Like if they go, I accept you as you are, what could they say literally instead?
I love you exactly as you are.
Yeah, perfect.
I
Okay,
affirm you exactly as you are.
yeah. Okay, good. I'm making sure we have really practical,
Yeah.
applicable, actionable things for people to take from this. Do you
Yeah.
have a third one that we could add in?
The third one is for parents to understand that they are also going through a process. And I want to expand this because of you talking about your previous guest, is to understand for anyone who comes out to you that it is going to shift how you have set up the story of who they are in your world. So, for parents specifically, when a baby's born, I'm going to take you back in time. You look down at its eyes and you probably projected forward an entire lifetime for your kid. You're like, oh, they're going to here, they go to school and they're going to play this thing and then they're going to graduate and become a doctor and go, ah, la, 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 la. And then a kid comes out and that changes the picture. And parents, I need you to have space to be able to grieve the dream you had for your kid.
Mm.
So then you can open up and meet your kid for exactly who they are. Same if you had a friend who suddenly came out to you at age 30, it's like, oh, I had an idea of who you are. I need to let that go, grieve it, and then be there to meet you and learn who you actually are.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I so le- so we've been talking about the ideal scenario where the individual who's coming out has the courage to come out. And I'm only using courage because there's the opposite of a child that's confused and isn't talking and isn't sharing. So if I'm a parent and I can observe and see something's going on for my kid and they're not opening up about it. Do you have any advice for that?
Well, point blank, this might be a time when you need to bring in a professional. You might need to bring in a therapy, a team. It might be a place where there's more going on than you as a parent may have been trained or educated to handle.
Mhm.
And bringing a kid to therapy shouldn't be a scary thing. I give lots of space for parents to ask me all kinds of questions. And, a lot of parents come in and do a session with me first because they're basically interviewing me and qualifying me. And I know what's going on, but I love it. Um, and it's okay to understand that perhaps you don't have all of the knowledge you need to support your kid in this moment.
Mm.
Understanding that for LGBTQIA plus kids, when they look up at their parental unit, we are one of the few minorities where our minority status is not represented in the family structure.
Mm.
So I'm a gay kid. I look up at two cis straight parents. I'm a non-binary kid. I look up at two cisgender parents. My minority status is not represented.
Mm.
So that's where bringing in expertise can really help in this process.
Yeah. And so on the topic of representation, how important do you think it is that the therapist has lived experience?
It's interesting because a lot of people who are supportive of the community often will say that they're LGBTQ friendly. And what that definition has come to mean for a lot of us in the community is like, I have an uncle who's gay. I had a best friend who was gay. It's not enough. What we need is people who are LGBTQI plus affirming, educated, and trained to work with our community.
Mm.
Do you necessarily have to be part of the community? I don't think so. There are other people in the community who would say, absolutely, you must be. But I think there is space as long as I come in with cultural humility and approach that space and get educated and have the experience to bring supportive environment into the work.
Yeah. I mean, I can assume that if you're really capable, identifying straight and cisgender, that you could still coach people through the process. But when you talk about, I think about kids that you're saying they're in a family unit where they're not represented at all. Uh, to give them access to someone that they can see themselves not even literally reflected, but see that it's safe to be that and become someone. I do like that idea of connecting with a therapist or coach or counselor that does have the lived experience for that individual.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
one of the challenges of that, if you're in a major metropolitan area, you may have access to that. But when you move out into the rural parts of the world, you're not going to have the same type of access to that.
Yeah.
And so that's why I travel all over the world at this point, trying to educate therapists, counselors, coaches, educators, working in the corporate environment to create affirming environments for my community,
Mm.
because then that energy can spread. And as I always say, you're meeting me today, I'm educating you on some of this, but this is just the tip of a really big iceberg. If
Mhm.
this is a community you want to support and you want to work with, this has to be an ongoing experience of learning and education. It can't be a one and done thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's so important to me for people to understand. It can't be like, I went to this one workshop with John Sovec and now I know everything about working with the LGBTQIA plus community. And I say, no, you don't.
I bet you're learning every day and getting better every day yourself.
I do. I'm a member of the community, and I would never assume that I know everything about my community's experience.
The one
And
thing
that's the excitement.
sorry. Oh, that's one thing that I say we can only ever be an expert in our own identity and our own self. Because someone with exact same identities as ourselves can have a completely different lived experience. So, yeah, good point. Um,
Mhm.
When you mentioned about access, right? The geography where you live can impact the access that you have to support services. There's also access around cost of therapy or support services. Are there any other ways that people perhaps that can't afford those services could get access to things that could support them?
Well, we do have some really great support systems working in bigger internet communities.
Mhm.
We have PFLAG, which is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. They understand that the transgender word is not mentioned, but they're very supportive of the trans community. They have lots of community-based meetings and organizations that take place all over the world. It's a really great place. Parents can also go online there and get information that will help them along. If we look at places like the Trevor Project, they're another organization that provide lots of support for families. And they have a really cool thing called the Trevor Forum. And it is a vetted forum for LGBTQIA plus kids to go on and connect and find community for themselves. The thing that's beautiful about it is vetted. You have to apply, someone looks at the application, and then you're allowed into the forum. And that creates a really safe space for these kids.
Yeah.
There are other resources like that out there, and with a little bit of work, actually have a resource guide in the back of my book. Parents can find those bigger, like national and international organizations. Well, then will help them to hone down into more specific things that might be available in their community.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing that. So you were saying you were talking about creating environments or spaces that are safe or affirming for the LGBTQI community. So if we've got someone from an organization listening, what are some of those things that you would help an organization or advise them to do to create that safe space?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to educate your entire workforce
Mhm.
from top to bottom, from the CEO to the person who's, pouring coffee, out front in the morning. Everyone needs to have this ability to understand the language, the most basic approach to respecting anyone in their community.
Mm.
You have that space from top to bottom in any organization to create spaces where representation matters. Once again, there's a lot of performative representation. June is Pride Month, and it's amazing how many corporations suddenly take over, being prideful in June, and then in July, they've moved on to the next thing. So it's about creating those spaces in the organization that exist on an ongoing basis. And oftentimes, it's about relying on the expertise of people within the community who can provide those resources, either coming into your company like I do, or working within the company itself to create affirmative organizations. They're
Mm.
really powerful experiences for people to say, oh, I work at this major corporation and we have an affinity organization that I get to, go to and have a meeting once a month and we go on trips and do all these things. This is support.
Mm.
This is saying, oh, you are a valuable part of our resource. So think less about performative and more about changing the corporate environment and language to be respectful to the communities that work for you.
I love that. Now, I don't know if you've seen my research on the eight inclusion needs of all people. So it's a way of addressing intersectionality in the workplace in reducing discrimination. And I think you've almost used every single one of the eight needs in your description. Everything from respect, support, language. We've talked about access already. So I do love that you're also saying that they're all intertwined. That's the point. If you just do one, meaning let's say opportunity to collaborate in an ERG, right? To make camaraderie and shared experiences and feel like you belong. But if you only got that in that little cohort, but you don't feel yourself represented across the hierarchy, or if the language people use around you is inappropriate, the point of just having that ERG is pointless
Mhm.
because that's not inclusion. That's a flash in the pan and leaving it to their own devices to make themselves feel like they belong, not changing the system itself. So, love all of your advice, John. In the questionnaire, there was two sections about reflecting on your own inclusion needs, and the first one was like the current state, like are those needs being met? And the second section was those, do you need those needs to be fulfilled to thrive in life and work? And in the importance to thrive, it's you've gone neutral, or at least three on a scale of one being not at all important to five being extremely important. Neutral on it being important to receive additional support when needed, and whether or not you would receive allowances at work. without judgment. So saying they're not important to you. Why are you neutral or on the fence on those?
You're gonna love this answer. So it's because I'm a Sagittarian. We are notoriously independent
Okay.
and notoriously blunt. And if you're not going to be there for us, we are going to go out and blaze a trail and walk forward into the world and learn what we need to learn and find the resources we need. Also, in my family mythology, that independence was really, really recognized and it was encouraged. And so for me, it's actually been a journey about learning how to let people in to support me while I still march along on this trailblazing path.
Yeah.
And so that for me would be why that is semi-neutral because I've learned to be incredibly powerful in how I move through the world. And so if I need some positive feedback, I know how to give it to myself. If I need some recognition, I can say, you did some good work today.
Yeah.
And that to me is a big part of the puzzle. And part of how I got there was through the practice of gratitude.
Mm.
And it's not just like I do a gratitude journal at the end of the day. I'm in gratitude that you and I are connecting to have this conversation today. I'm in gratitude that you opened up space for it to even exist. I'm in gratitude that my camera is working. I'm in gratitude that I have this beautiful office that I can sit in and feel protected and safe to have this conversation with you. Gratitude permeates every moment of my life.
Mm.
And that's part of what creates this beautiful strength for me.
Not everyone is as fortunate as that, obviously. And so I mean, if you think of it, is it ironic? I don't know. Perhaps it's more of an Alanis Morissette
I was
song.
like, Alanis Morissette or ironic, yeah. It's like, really ironic, Alanis.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm like, oh, maybe it's more like a song. But this is literally what you do. So while you're saying, I don't really need it for me to thrive, you actually are providing the support that people need to thrive, and providing those allowances, or at least equipping organizations and families to provide those allowances so people can thrive. So, that's what, quite honestly, why I found your answers interesting.
Mhm. Well, and I think it's so important to understand that me doing the work on myself isn't just a selfish act. It's me doing the work on myself so then I could step up into the world and say, this world we're walking through is painful for 99.8% of the people walking through it. And if I'm part of that, 0.02% that could provide just a little bit of light into the world, then I am honored to be that and I am duty bound to follow through on that.
I'm so with you there on that journey, John. I remember in the moment of finding out that my son had died by suicide, and in those few, I mean, I'm going to say moments, I don't know how long it was. I remember in my hysteria saying, I don't want this to change me. Like, I actually said it out loud. My husband told me afterwards. And it's funny, it does change you, right? It can't not change you. And I think what I meant at the time was I didn't want to lose my spark. I didn't want to lose my positivity and ability to share and educate and uplift and all those kinds of things. So I say, you're right. If we have this capability and outlook, we have a responsibility.
Mhm. And it's also about understanding that both good and bad, positive, negative, if you want to call them those things, are going to happen in all of our lives. It's not some just playful, optimistic unicorns and rainbows world that I live in, but it is about knowing that I'm anchored and grounded and I can experience all of these highs and lows. And I can allow myself to feel anger and hurt and pain and joy and ecstasy. All of those things are of value.
Mm.
We live in a world that tells us we're supposed to always be pursuing bliss. And I think that is a misguided step. Instead, let's seek for realness. Let's say, I am angry at this moment because this thing happened. Why am I angry? How am I angry? How's it feel in my body? Wow, what am I learning from this anger? And then I take the next step and I'm not angry. I'm saying, oh, that shouldn't happen again. Social justice, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel really sad today. Why am I sad? Because it's a memory of a certain loss or a day like this. Wow, that's such a beautiful thing to be able to remember that person who's no longer with us. Oh, let me carry that into the day. To say that bliss is not the place that we're supposed to straitjacket ourselves into, but being a fully realized human being, not getting lost or locked in any of these emotional states, but moving through them and with them is so vital to our well-being.
You're so right. I mean, I one of the things that I try to remind myself in those moments of grief is I have this grief because I had a son, and not
Mhm.
everyone had the privilege of having a son. So, it's perspective, it's the lens that we apply to our stories. And I think, you talk about that bliss, that search of bliss. I think it can feel like a ball and chain to younger generations coming through now. And we're going down a completely different rabbit hole to inclusion right now. But because you talked about that, I think that that conversation around find your purpose to this younger generation, I'm like, that's a lot of pressure,
Mhm.
and I'm like, you know what? Your purpose will come to you. Just do some work so you can live on the weekend and, just follow, just go one step in front of the other rather than going, I can't do anything. I'm paralyzed because I don't know what my purpose is. And that spirals them.
And one of the things that I do, and the kids I work with adore it. So, especially when they're a senior in high school, everyone's asking, where are you going to college and what are you going to do? And they're supposed to have an answer saying, oh, I'm going to Stanford, I'm going pre-med. But here's the question I bring into our conversations. How do you want to be in the world? And the moment I ask that question, their little heads go to the side like a questioning dog. They're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I explain, it's just like, do you want to become a generous person? Do you want to become a kind person? Do you want to become a passionate person? Do you want to become a thought leader? How do you want to be in the world?
Hmm.
And once we get that like communication bridge opened up, they're so excited to explore that as a possibility of what they want to become versus, oh, I'm supposed to become a doctor, a lawyer, or a dentist.
I think that's brilliant because if you layer that with what I like is the what problem do you want to solve in the world, you then it's like a balancing scale because you could actually solve a problem and do it in a really asshole way. So
You could.
I now like the idea of adding in the but how do you want to show up in the world? So you and I, we're a good team. Um, a balancing act. Um, so, John, we've talked right throughout the episode of look how you're leveraging your intersectionality and your lived experience in the world. Um, so, I'm going to put all of your contact details in the description of the podcast, including the link to your book, so people can access that as a resource. Are there any final it came out all wrong. Are there any final magical bits of inspiration or learnings that you can share with people?
I guess the thing that I would bring forward is you and I have had this conversation and we've talked about some really intense and deep stuff. Everyone who's listening is going to be at a different place in their journey of learning about these topics that we discussed. And be kind to yourself, be gentle to yourself, be curious, as I used that word earlier from my own, traveling through the world. Don't feel like you have to suddenly know it all. It is a journey. I work in the LGBTQIA plus community. I am a member, and there are moments when I still mess up, and that's okay. I'm an imperfect human being. I am learning every step of the way. So take what you heard us share today and find where that's going to lead you in
Mhm.
your journey of personal growth.
Oh, brilliant advice. And then I say, because I learn something new every day, hopefully. And then once you know better, you do better. Do better today and tomorrow. Just don't feel guilty for yesterday because today, now you know better, you'll do better today. Thank you so much for your time, John.
Thank you.